Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. While we're all situated across Australia and perhaps the rest of the world, we are still gathering virtually, and I personally am in Melbourne. So I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay my respect to the elders, both past and present, and of the Kulin Nation, and extend respect to other Indigenous Australians that are present today. Griffith Hack are very pleased to present the seminar today. It's entitled Improving Collaboration Between Startups, SMEs and Research Organisations. My name is Kathryn Morris and I'm a principal in the Chemistry Life Sciences team of Griffith Hack. I've been a patent attorney for over 20 years and my practice is predominantly local, and I act for a number of small and medium-sized mostly pharma and agricultural companies in Australia, as well as a number of universities. Today, I'm pleased that Brian Ruddle from Impact Innovation will be joining us. Brian has been involved in the innovation sector for over 25 years, and his company Impact Innovation was founded in 2006 and has expanded since then to a 25-person team that provides innovation, commercialisation and collaboration services to a number of entities such as multinationals, SMEs, startups, universities, not-for-profits and government agencies. Brian and his colleagues are skilled at helping innovators turn their ideas into profitable products and services. Today, we're going to discuss collaborations between small and medium-sized entities, startups and research organisations such as universities. Through our practices, both Brian and I have observed collaborations that have been perhaps less than ideal, maybe because of mismatched expectations or less than satisfactory outcomes to one or both parties. Brian's going to discuss aspects of collaboration and I'm going to discuss more IP issues that might be pertinent. Just to point out that you can ask questions throughout the discussion and our moderator will collate them and we'll have a question session at the end of the seminar. So let's get started. Brian, over to you.
Thanks very much for that, Kathryn, and it's great to touch base with everyone. I suppose the key thing that we're going to be touching on today is this this concept of communication around a lot of R&D management. And so I thought I'd just quickly just share my screen and we'll sort of step through a few slides and sort of explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. Now, Kathryn, just doing a double check. You can see my screen now, can you?
Yes, I can.
That's great, thank you. So as Kathryn said, and as I just mentioned a moment ago, this concept of communication around R&D is something that we've been looking at for quite a while, because what we're seeing is that with some of the disconnect that's occurring with it, this is where a lot of the challenges are lying, or the less than optimal outcomes are occurring. But before I sort of step through, there's probably a couple of little warnings that we'll sort of put at the start of this. The first is that I'm going to be using a number of generalizations when I talk about this topic. We know that there's some really great examples out there where people are doing some great things, but in the interest of sort of, I suppose, sharing where things can be improved, we will be using generalizations. The second thing is about what you're going to get out of this particular session. So we run a lot of capacity building type events, and what we sort of find is it's really useful for people to have a piece of paper or somewhere where you can take notes, and really encourage you to do so during today's session, because ultimately, while we hope you get something out of today, we'd really love it if you actioned those things. And that's the true definition, if you like, of capacity building and sort of, sharing of knowledge and things along those lines, is that you actually get some value out of it at the end of the day. To start with, I'd like to sort of share I suppose, an example of where communication can really go wrong when it comes to collaborative R&D. And this is an example I was involved in, well, gosh, it's close to about 10 or 12 years ago now. It's a fair while ago, but funnily enough, I showed this presentation recently, and this is how we actually got to doing this presentation today. Kathryn was sort of talking about a similar example that she'd come across as well. And so even though this happened a long time ago, it's still happening now. And so this example's around a company that had superior genetics around a particular tree crop, and they'd approached a university to put that particular tree crop into tissue culture. And so the research team, did the job. They collected seed, they grew those seeds up, and essentially developed a tissue culture protocol based off cotyledons. And so the report back to the company was that here's your successful outcome, here's the tissue culture protocol. The problem was, though, that during the design of the project and then also during the implementation, the researchers weren't aware that actually what the commercial partner wanted was the elite lines to be put into tissue culture, not just from seed, because this tree actually didn't breed true to type. So the seeds that were being used are actually crossbreds. So that wasn't actually from that elite tree at all. And so while there was a tissue culture protocol, it wasn't actually going to deliver what the company actually needed. So this is just one example, and look, many of you online have probably come across other ones as well, where this communication piece at key points within the R&D process is one of the key reasons that we don't get as many successful outcomes as we probably should. So some of the things we're going to be talking about today is about the thinking that's happening from both the commercial side or the industry side and also the researcher side. And I suppose I've been very fortunate over the years that I've worked on both sides. I've managed research teams within research organisations that are doing this, these sorts of projects. But then I've also worked with multinationals, other large corporates, SMEs and startups that have been engaging research organisations to do these things. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today, and Kathryn's going to be giving some of her experiences as well, is what actually some of the discussions are happening, what different discussions are happening at either side of the fence, if you like, through the whole process. And we're going to do that through, I suppose, three key areas. So it's when developing the R&D design, during implementation of the project, and at the end when we're sort of defining what success looks like. And then at the end, what we'll do is we'll sort of step through and talk about enhancing outcomes and tips and tricks and ways of actually improving communication. Now, as Kathryn said at the start, we'll be doing a Q&A at the end. So as you're going through, please feel free to start putting questions in through the system. If you think I think it's on the right-hand side, it's got show Q&A. You can put Q&A through that process. I believe that Gemma has also sent through a link to the slides, so you can actually access these slides, and the link's been put in the, I think it was the chat, or it'll be in the Q&A section. So if you do a bit of a search, you'll be able to track that down. But we'll show you that at the end as well. So let's kick things off in terms of when we're designing the scope, if you like, around R&D. Sort of going through about what the thinking is. And so from a corporate perspective, there's a whole range of reasons why they're wanting to actually bring together a scope, a research scope. And so the discussions that often occur around the decision making are things like, well, we need some independence around a piece of research. And that could be part of what they're looking for with this particular scope. It could be that they're struggling to develop a new product or service and they're needing help. It could be that they've got a particular problem, pardon me, and what they're wanting to do is to get some help in solving that particular problem. It could be that they've just decided that they're about to do some capital raising, and that linking in and having a research project going with the university could help with that validation and actually just improve their overall process. And look, these are just some of the reasons, I suppose, some of the discussions that are happening around boardroom tables as to what organisations are trying to get out of a particular, collaborative research project. And the thinking that's going behind what they want to achieve when it comes to what the scope looks like. So often after there's an initial meeting that occurs with the research organisations or the researchers, and then within the research team, they'll often have a meeting and they will start discussing different things. So they'll often start talking about a need for the time frame. So the corporates might be coming in saying that they're wanting something to happen in 6 months or 8 months or even less time. Often from the research side, there's discussions around, well, do we probably need a longer time frame? And often this is an HR issue more than a discussion around the scope around the research, because in some cases, engaging a research team for a 3-month project is really problematic. Not all the time, but sometimes it is. And we've seen situations where, that hasn't been communicated back to the corporate team, and the corporate team is very confused as to why the research team wants to turn a 7-month project into a 12-month project. But often it is around this: how do they engage the research team? Often there's discussions happening about how to keep team members. So often when corporates are engaging with researchers or research organisations, they might know the lead researcher in some cases, but often there's not a lot of discussion around who's on the team. On the researcher front, they've got postdocs and research assistants that are around the place, and they're often looking at, well, how can they bring them into the team and keep those teams going? They may or may not be the right people, and that's something that often needs to be looked at a bit more. Often there's a discussion at the researcher level around leveraging funds. And so this is sort of around how to, sort of do an ARC link grant or some other sort of ARC type project or other projects. And sort of often there's this whole thing about, well, what can we do about leveraging? Talk often about publications. Now that isn't a negative thing at all, because in some cases that actually might be what the corporate team needs. A lot of people look down on publications, but I've been in corporate team discussions that if they're doing capital raising or they're looking for I suppose the benefit of having the research organisation name on documents, having publications can often help them. So that's not necessarily a negative. But sorry, just stepping back, but I suppose the concept and why we're presenting it this way is because often we've got two teams that are talking about different things in terms of what their priorities are or what they're looking for from this potential collaborative research project. So doing the next step is sort of looking at the thinking during implementation. So from the corporate team, there's actually a lot of trust, and I've sat around a number of boardroom tables where there's a lot of trust that the research team knows what they're doing, which is all fine, but there's some challenges around that, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's a feeling that they're going to get some really valuable insights and outcomes from the engagement. They've paid their money. They understand what's in the contract, all of that sort of stuff, and they're expecting to get outcomes, even though it's research. And that they sort of think they're going to be able to use those research outcomes pretty quickly and pretty easily. They also think that the quarterly reports paint the whole picture. And again, a lot of the corporates are used to getting reports, and they see them as documents that give a very clear picture, if you like, as to what's actually happening. So the issue, I suppose, is that there's this disconnect still happening during implementation if there's not enough communication happening between the two sides. So often there's these quarterly meetings that are being held that are based off quarterly reports, but there's actually a lot of other things that are happening on both sides that neither side is actually aware of. So on the research front, often the big focus is on delivering on scope. They're not actually concerned, the research team generally isn't concerned, and it's not actually their job, about what's happening from a strategy perspective within the corporate. So while the corporate team is trusting, if you like, the researchers, what I've heard in a lot of these meetings is that they're trusting that the researchers understand that, their operating environment changes in the strategy. There's actually a lot of assumptions that corporates make which are just wrong, and actually puts a lot of stress and strain on research teams, because it's not the job of research teams to stay abreast of a lot of that stuff. Researchers are focused on delivering scope. With a lot of corporates don't understand how experiments are run. So a number of times I've been sitting in research meetings, we used to, with one team, we used to meet fortnightly, and often it was about running an experiment, and if it worked or didn't work, it would then dictate, if you like, the next piece of work. And so there's a lot of iteration, and the number of times I was sitting in and actually helped to design that next experiment to give our corporate partner, in this case, more information and insights. It happened all the time, because if we did it that way, we actually got better outcomes. But because a lot of corporates don't understand that, they sort of sit back and they just hope that the researchers know what they're after and how to design these experiments to give the information that the corporates need. And so if there isn't regular meetings, this is where we run into a lot of problems. Often, and I know Kathryn's going to be talking about this a bit more in a moment, but this whole thing of ownership around experiments and the IP that's used with these experiments was another thing that I used to, I suppose, really look out for when I was sitting in on these types of meetings. Because getting back to that first dot point, the research team is trying to achieve scope. A lot of corporates don't realise that research teams within Australia and a number of other jurisdictions can actually use other people's IP to run those experiments. They're allowed to do that, which is fine. But what the problem is that if that IP is brought into the process, it means that if the corporate partner wants to use that in a commercial way, they often have to get a license to use that other IP. And so that was one of the checks we used to do for every experiment, is whose IP are we really accessing here? Do we have rights? And if we don't have rights, or we don't think we can get rights, well, we can't use that, even though it might prove up a concept or whatever. We can't use it because from a commercial perspective, we can't use the outcome, or we can't adapt it and adopt it into a commercial scenario. Often within research teams, and this frustrates a lot of commercial partners, there's discussions around expanding the relationship and, again, accessing grants rather than focusing in on what the research is really trying to do. And also, research teams generally don't like doing a lot of reporting. And so while the corporates rely on the quarterly reports, or whatever the reports are that are coming out of the research process, the research teams often don't like putting a lot into those. And there's not too many quarterly reports that I've seen that have basically said we should shut this project down. So while the corporates rely on them, they're generally about keeping projects going rather than looking at it from the commercial perspective about, should this continue or not. And this again isn't the fault of the research team. It's actually a mismatch, if you like, of what different groups are trying to get out of this. And team members, this is the other one. Again, you have to really watch what team members are coming into these projects. We often see a lot of students being brought in without adequate controls around IP and things like that. And it's really an important thing, that when research teams are bringing other team members in, that there's a bit of control around a lot of that. So I'll hand over to Kathryn, who's got a couple of slides now and sort of going to talk a little bit about IP and ownership and things like that, and particularly this whole concept of bringing other team members in and students. So Kathryn, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Okay, the first thing I was going to talk about is utilising new technologies that that Brian mentioned in that slide. And I guess if a new technology is used in the research, and that new technology is the subject of a patent, there are implications for commercialisation of that technology, particularly if it's used in the commercial product or in making the commercial product, as Brian indicated. So it's important for a company to understand the risk of infringing another person's patent when they commercialise their project or their product. So sometimes they won't be knowing what the company won't be knowing what the research group is actually doing, or whether any of the technologies they're actually using are patented technologies. So having communication about whether something is they've used something that's patented or the subject of a patent is important, so that the company can assess any risk that they may have. And that's not to say that a patented technology cannot be used, but it's important for the company to understand whether the technology or activity that is being used in the research is within the scope of a claim of a patent owned by another person, who owns that patent, and whether the patent's in force or will expire soon. This sort of information can decide whether a license to the technology might be required, or perhaps the patent's lapsed and it's not required at all, or perhaps it'll lapse before you actually get the product on the market. So it might not be important to take a license. It might be that it's much better to have an alternative non-patented technology used in the research rather than the new technology. It might be that the new technology that is used in the research is, adds something super duper to the product, and therefore it's really worthwhile having access to that technology. And it might be worthwhile then the company investigating a license and how they might be able to incorporate the technology with that license. Alternatively, if the technology is just new, but it doesn't actually add very much to the project or the product and that ends up on the market, then an alternative non-patented technology might be much better, because you're not going to have to pay for it. So all those sorts of things need to be considered with new technologies. So it's not that you don't want to use them at all, it's that there needs to be some sort of assessment about how appropriate they are. Also, while there's an exemption for infringement that Brian referred to earlier, that's set out in the Patents Act, and it's in relation to at least some research activities, perhaps not all. Once that research is completed and the product goes onto the market, there is no exemption for that, because there's no longer research. So any licenses or any patented technologies have to be dealt with before a product goes on the market. It's therefore important for both parties to communicate and understand where there are patented technologies used in the project, so that at the outset, or if they're incorporated along the way, the company can investigate whether licenses are required and assess any risk that they may have by using those technologies. Could I have the next slide, Brian, please?
Yep, there we go.
Okay, the other thing that that Brian mentioned in his last slide was to do with team members. And team members, I'm talking really here about the research team members, and these are very important consideration because they can make and break a project. Some team members will contribute to the inventive concept or solve problems in an inventive way, and therefore may be considered inventors if a patent is subsequently filed. Other team members might conduct experiments or analysis under supervision and therefore may not be considered inventors. But I think it's important if a project is planning on resulting in patents that issues such as employment status, the need for publication, length of time available of each of the participants, and the skills brought to the project, or the skills that might be learnt on the project, should be considered. Postdocs and research assistants and also the research leaders are likely to be employees of the university with an IP ownership clause in their employment contracts. And this means that the university will own their intellectual property produced in any research project and can therefore make representations about that ownership in any agreement or contract that's made by the university with the company when they're at the outset of the project. Often PhD students are different. They're often not employees of the university, and therefore, at least in some universities, they own their own IP that they produce while working on their PhDs. At the outset, with selection of team members, it's necessary to consider whether the IP produced by a PhD student is actually going to be owned by the university or the company if that PhD student is involved in the project. If not, then it's necessary to have a contract with that PhD student to ensure the ownership vests with either the university or the company or both. Research assistants can also be, for example, short-term employees that might be on a summer vacation scholarship or on a employment over the summer, and they can be really useful for performing sufficient examples to provide support for a patent specification. And so it's important to make sure that any employment contract that they might have includes some sort of IP clause. Okay, postdocs can be time limited in their contract, and considering how long they'll be available may also be important, as bringing in new team members along the project can affect the ability of the team to meet any milestones such as timeline milestones. Other things around postdocs is that sometimes they're from overseas and not necessarily around Australia, and it's important if a patent is filed that they're contactable long after leaving their position at the university or research organisation, because often patent documents need to be filed or signed by inventors sometimes 3 or more years after filing the first initial patent application. So we need to be able to contact people that are involved and stay in touch with them. There's some other things that are important to consider for team members as well in their own personal, I guess, where they want to go with their careers. PhD students, and to some extent postdocs, often require publications to continue their academic careers. And I'm going to talk a little more about publication subsequently. However, in commercial research projects, publication may be significantly delayed, and in some cases, PhD theses can be embargoed. This can be detrimental for obtaining a postdoc after completing a PhD or an academic position after completing a postdoc. I have to, I'll relate here an experience I had that when I was very, I guess, early on in my career, I was at a conference giving a poster on some sort of IP related topic, and I was approached by a young woman who had just finished or submitted her thesis, and she was very annoyed because she'd been doing a industry project for her PhD, and the project had been completed, but no patents had been filed as yet, and they were considering what they were doing and all of that. And she got to the end of her PhD and her thesis was embargoed and she had no publications and she was unable to get a postdoc. And she was most distressed about this because this wasn't her plan for her career. So I guess, you know, that it is important to think about the the futures of the people in the team too, and whether there might be something detrimental in having them for their careers, I guess, as well. But this is not to say that PhD students and postdocs shouldn't be included as team members, because especially if they're entrepreneurial, they might be really interested in seeing how a company works and how research can be incorporated into a company, and they might actually learn a lot, and those skills could be very valuable in their future. But it's really important that all team members understand the likelihood of publication delay if there's going to be IP involved. So I think back to you, Brian.
That's great. Thanks for that, Kathryn. And just adding to a point around students, and particularly postdocs that may be from other countries, is just around lab books as well. We've had situations where, from the corporate side, recognition that during handover that lab books hadn't been signed, things like that, which, depending on what you're trying to do with it, could become problematic, particularly if you're trying to do license deals with overseas groups and things along those lines. And so that another one can be really problematic in terms of getting those, crossing the T's, dotting the I's sort of stuff all sorted, and it's just being aware of that. So I sort of mentioned, so we've sort of covered off on designing an R&D scope and some of the communication challenges, the implementation, and how the different groups are thinking. And I suppose this is sort of just touching now on, how do we define success? So from the corporate side or the industry side, they're often very short-sighted in terms of they think that they should be able to use a research outcome immediately. And I'll talk a bit more about this a bit later on. But it's a pretty unrealistic expectation, but it's one that we see time and time again. They're always talking about on time, on budget, because that's the way they deal with contracts generally, and that's sort of where they sort of see it as being important in terms of what success looks like. Moving on to the R&D side of things, the thinking around success is really around validated outcomes that stand up to peer review. Now, this is an understandable approach, but it is a bit of a disconnect with what corporates are looking for. And it was interesting, I was fortunate enough to be invited to a DVCR meeting, and we were sort of talking about this thing of what corporates are wanting, because in a lot of cases they don't need a peer-reviewed outcome initially anyway. They need information to be able to make decisions. But most collaborative research projects are really focused on the rigor around the research, which, if you're going for a patent, and you need all that down the track, but sometimes you just need, quick and dirty, look-see type research outcomes initially, to be able to inform decision making before maybe then going on and sort of doing something that can stand up to peer review. It's a conversation that we're not seeing enough of, but interestingly enough, I should say, in that DVCR meeting, there was actually recognition at that level that within a lot of the research organisations, they need to start delivering that sort of research outcome as a precursor to more validated research activities. So that'll be interesting to see whether that starts to play out in practice. Publications, of course, but as I said earlier, that can also be a very valuable thing for the corporate partner, but it needs to be discussed around timing, and Kathryn's points around that are very, very real, because we've seen similar situations happen a lot. A lot of discussion around the success of having patents in place. Now, one of the challenges with some of the patenting and a lot of the commercial multinationals are getting it more and more. Larger corporates that don't do a lot of patenting in Australia, probably not so much, is that you can have a patent in place, but often it won't give you the data that you need to actually commercialise. I used a plant example earlier on, so I'll use another one around Arabidopsis. So there's a lot of work that's being done on Arabidopsis, but then when we start pitching those research outcomes to multinationals, they just shake their head at us because they know that it's actually going to take a lot longer to validate that into other crops and things like that. So it's just understanding, the value of patents at an early stage. Not saying that, shouldn't say that they're not what we should be aiming for, but it's understanding about the data that's going into the patents. PhD student completes the thesis is another one there. And I suppose the other thing that we see a lot of discussions around is the next research project. And again, the thinking behind it is, well, we don't want to wrap these projects up. And we've just finished doing a job, probably can't say they are, they're a very, very large research organisation around their commercialisation strategies. And so one of the things we talked about was wrap up. And in a lot of cases, wrap up or handover, if you like, isn't built into research projects. So there isn't actually a process in place to finish a research project in most cases. It's all about how do you get the next pot of cash? How do you keep a project going? What's the next project that comes out of it? And so this is a frustrating thing that from a corporate side, they get hit up a lot for the next project when they're wanting the research outcome initially. And so, again, we've got sometimes a bit of a communication disconnect there. But I'll head back over to Kathryn because, again, Kathryn's got some really good points around publications, patents, and particularly this student thesis thing again.
Okay, thank you. I guess one of the things that is important is controlling publication. This is really important to the company if they wish to have patent protection. As most of you will be aware, to obtain patent protection, an invention must be new or novel, and this means that before the patent is filed, the invention must be kept confidential and not published or disclosed in the public domain. This is usually not a problem for companies that when they're working on their own, as they have control of all publication of the research that they're doing. However, there is a tension between publication and patenting that affects university researchers or institute researchers, where publication is important to them. So you need to balance this tension. And just because we're patenting something doesn't mean that the research cannot be published. What it does mean is that there's likely to be a delay between doing the research and the publication while patenting is considered and sufficient exemplification is completed. But it's also important to understand what publication is, because it's not just a journal article published in a journal. It also includes things like posters, oral presentations, abstracts, ASX announcements, news releases, all the things that both companies and universities both want to do to, for many different reasons, I guess. Abstract books, as a lot of us know that go to conferences, are often published at a conference, and who hasn't been in a conference where we all used to meet in person all together, where you're sitting there and as the slides come up, all the hands go up with the mobile phones or iPads, and people are taking photographs right, left and centre of the slides as they come up. All of that is has the potential to damage patentability because all of that is public record. So all of these things can be considered publications. So what can you do and when can you do it? Since this talk is about communication, there should be good communication between the company and the research group. For example, the company may wish to review journal articles, posters, oral presentations, slides, etc. before any publication occurs, and may want to actually have veto rights or the right to say, I don't want you to say that. In my experience, posters and oral presentations may be a viable kind of presentation that may be made, provided that the disclosure doesn't disclose enough information for another person to perform the invention or understand everything about the invention. For example, I'm actually a chemist, so sometimes it might be that you could have a poster presentation where you might present some results, but any compound used in those examples or the exemplification in the poster is referred to only by a number and not by a structure, and no information relating to the structure of the compound is presented. I guess in general, journal articles tend to give a lot of information away, and really they can only be published after a patent has been filed. However, both company and research group need to consider any type of publication and whether it will affect patentability before that publication occurs. So there needs to be communication about what you want to do. I've got clients who have sent an abstract to me they've found on the internet from somebody they're collaborating with that sent an abstract off to an international conference. It's been published on the internet and they weren't even aware they were going to go. And, you know, without control of the disclosure, you know, there is the possibility of putting any patent in jeopardy by making disclosures like that, even though they're unintentional in terms of damaging the likelihood of patents being able to be filed. Mm. For a company, there's also the pressure to make press releases, perhaps to make sure investors stay interested in your in the company and what's happening, or they have a great need when something happens to make a ASX announcement because they have to. And these can also be done without disclosing the essentials of any invention. I certainly assist a number of my clients with crafting news releases and ASX announcements to avoid disclosing patentable information so that they can meet requirements of the company or of the ASX without damaging their patentability of research that they're having done. Okay, next slide, please. So on the flip side, patenting needs to be considered, and when to patent is important. So some projects there'll be no patenting, and at the beginning Brian referred to sometimes it's important for the company to get a journal article, and in that case publication might be the way to go, and they might want to do that quickly, and that might be satisfactory for everybody. But in sometimes or some cases where patenting is going to become important in protecting the commercial product that ends up on the market, then we need to consider what's required and when to file a patent during the research project. So as we've discussed, in ideal circumstances for the company, there's no publication before a provisional application is filed, and in some cases even before a PCT application is filed. But this may need to be balanced with the needs of the research group. While it's possible to file a patent with a single example that provides plausibility to the invention or provides an expectation that the invention works, many countries now are considering whether a patent specification provides sufficient examples to demonstrate that the invention will work across the full scope of the claim. Now, as I said earlier, I'm a chemist, so in my technology, often we want to cover a broad scope of compounds in a patent, and a number of different compounds will need to be exemplified, both by synthesis and by biological or chemical testing. Many countries might want to limit to a reasonable extrapolation from what is exemplified, and different countries can be narrow or broad in terms of what they think a reasonable extrapolation is. So while examples maybe need not be to the quality required for a peer-reviewed journal article, patent examples must be sufficient quality to let a person who works in the field of that technology to consider that the invention would work and that they would be able to perform the invention. So the need for examples might delay a patent being filed and therefore publication. Once the patent is filed, any publication should also include only what is in the patent specification and not any new information. Sometimes a patent application is filed and there's perhaps a delay of 6 months between filing the patent application and when the manuscript is ready to go to a journal. And sometimes new information sneaks into the manuscript and it's not in the patent. it's really important that that communication about publication needs to continue, because it might be that that information, that's the new information, is really important to the invention, and we should revise the patent specification and refile it before any publication occurs. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is perhaps something more to do with at the outset of the collaboration, having a consideration about who owns the IP. It's a really important issue to agree, usually at the outset of the project, who's going to own the IP and how it's going to be managed. Has the company brought the whole idea to the research group and wants a proof of concept? The company might be the owner of all of it and pay for the service. In an alternative, the company might pose a problem and the research group solve it, and the university may own all, or it may be jointly owned. But ownership in any contract needs to be clear and agreed upon, and the company may take outright ownership and may license the university to for research purposes. The university may also take ownership and may license exclusively to the company to allow commercialization. There are lots of different permutations of this, and that's why it should be agreed upon, so everybody is clear who owns the IP and what will be happening. Co-ownership is also an option, but I think that that is a little less than ideal often, because there's less clarity about what might happen in the future. When a patent is co-owned, each owner may do as they would like without reference to the other. So there could be that the company would license their share of the patent to a large company and make a large profit that the university might not share in. Alternatively, the university may license to a big company, ultimately damaging the prospects of the company that they were originally working with. And for this, you have to remember that patents actually are around for 20 years from filing a PCT application, which is a long time. And while relationships may be harmonious at the beginning of a relationship, they may break down over a period of 20 years, or you know, they just may not be maintained, and all the people that were originally in that relationship are not there anymore subsequently. So you know, need to think about these things and make sure that all the ownership issues are sorted out. It's better to agree on ownership terms, royalties, milestone payments and timelines, those sorts of things at the beginning, and make it part of the contract. One of my colleagues has messaged me and also indicated that another thing to think about with team members, to go back to our earlier team member slide, when picking team members, another thing that might be important in terms of patents is that if you have a foreign student or a foreign postdoc that then goes back and resides overseas in their home country, there might be some issues with needing to get foreign filing licenses from those jurisdictions before you can file a patent in any other country. So those sorts of issues might need to be considered as well when thinking about team members. Another thing about the team members is that with ownership, often we need to have it in writing, and there might need to be assignments. Even if there is a contract of employment, assignments should also be completed and originals stored safely for proof of ownership, should that be needed later. Also, because research team members may disappear over time or may leave under maybe less than happy circumstances, it's better to have assignment documents executed as soon as possible to make sure that all the ownership vests with the right people and that you're not having to chase people subsequently because they've disappeared or aren't contactable anymore. I think it's also important to agree at the beginning as to who manages the IP. And in managing the IP, I mean who's in control of the information. There can be lots of collaborative discussion amongst the research team and the company, but there should be one instructor for the patent attorney and one person that's responsible for managing the relationship with the patent attorney, and not many people, so that there's only one lot of instructions that are received and they're clear. Can also include agreement on who pays for the IP, and this can be useful, or it could be what proportion is paid by each party, but agreement on this can also lead to a more harmonious relationship, so disagreements on payments don't occur. And it might also be useful to agree about what happens to the IP if it's no longer wanted by one of the parties down the track. You know, can one party just let it lapse? Should it be offered to the other party as a first right of refusal before it might get sold, or before it's allowed to lapse? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is my little summary, I guess. So companies, I think, need to be considering all the time ownership and licenses. Yes, no points for proceeding, and if they're not proceeding, what happens to the research and what happens to any IP that's related to that. When to patent and when to publish, and communicating around those things all the time. And I've put freedom to operate under universities, but that's actually something the companies actually need to be considering. But communication and changes in research technologies and what technologies might be patented is important for communication between the university and the companies, so that that freedom to operate can be considered, and any risks around that considered as well. And universities need to be thinking about publication, can they do it, and what communication they need to make with companies around that. And as I said earlier, who should be involved is an important consideration, and how that might affect the patenting of that down the track should be balanced with the skills that each person might bring. So I'm going to hand back to Brian now, and he's going to continue with his part of the talk.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that, Kathryn. And just a reminder, everyone, please sort of feed questions through. I know we're sort of hitting time a little bit with this, but I'll sort of speed through the rest of these slides to make sure we've got enough time for Q&A at the end. But I suppose we've been sort of talking a lot about communication, and essentially, I suppose what we see is as sort of, we've got objectives from the commercial perspective, we've got objectives from the research perspective, and it's all about, well, how do we move from that into a process where we actually have combined objectives, and that's around, you know, time and risk and value, and a lot of it comes back down to this focus on R&D communication and management. Yeah, a lot of the things that Kathryn was talking about, you know, and a lot of you online today or listening to this presentation have got a lot of experience in the space of commercialisation, but these, you know, small things around communication we're seeing being missed a lot, and it's the small stuff that starts to impact on these relationships. So I suppose what we talk to a lot of our clients about in terms of communication is thinking of it a lot more like a system of what's the process that you actually go through to manage communications. You know, is it set up so that from a corporate perspective, they're treating the R&D team like any other business unit? You know, they don't talk to marketing every quarter. They don't talk to the accounts team every quarter. They actually talk to them quite a lot. There's a lot of discussion that happens within a corporate environment. And why aren't they having those same discussions with the R&D team and treat them like an internal team, even though they may be external? You know, understand the management structure around the project. It's not, so one of the biggest challenges we see around communication is that a lot of the collaborative research projects are actually transactional. We pay our money, research is done, we get the results. There's actually not much around joint management. Yes, there might be review committees and things like that, but you know, what is the team management structure around the whole process? Does the corporate team have their own project activities? Now, what I mean by that is this diagram is something that we brought together to show our clients where things can go wrong with turning an idea or a research outcome into a product or service. And the proof of concept or the research part is only one part of it. There's actually a need for the corporates to do a lot of their own activities around regulatory, communications around IP management, of course, but, the adoption costs, what is the problem? Is the problem still there? Does it need to be tweaked? Things about management, the resourcing to actually commercialise, what information is going to be required, the scalability, there's a whole range of different things that need to be looked at, information that needs to be gathered. And we see that a lot of corporate partners aren't aware of these things, and they're waiting for the researchers to deliver something that miraculously will be commercialised, and it just generally doesn't happen. So it's important that the corporate teams have their own project activities. There's processes for monitoring and evaluation of progress, and sort of making sure that they're assessing, if you like, the changes to the operating environment. We see a lot of 12-month, 2-year, 3-year projects where changes in the operating environment aren't being taken into account to tweak experiments, to tweak objectives, and they end up with a research outcome and there's products already in the market. There's a lot of that corporates need to be focused on a lot more in that area. And on the research side, do they understand how the research outcomes are going to be used? Are there opportunities to have discussions around that where they're contributing to that? Because often those discussions aren't happening. The discussions are really about corporates checking on how the research team's going, not trying to involve, that first point on the corporate side, how to involve research teams as a business unit. Improving the scope, the flexibility around scope and modifying scope to meet the requirements going forward, the design experiments around adoption and getting information. I talked earlier around, yes, at times you need the peer-reviewed research outcomes, but early on, sometimes you don't. You need information to be able to make a decision to then spend more money to do that more validation type research. The handover strategy I mentioned earlier on, the challenges around that, and that it's really important that there's a robust handover strategy. We've been running training sessions for research groups on handover for that exact reason of sort of what is actually required to successfully complete a project. And sort of looking at running experiments as quickly as possible. Because what tends to happen is at the start of a research project, there's the plan, and there's sort of a pretty linear, if we do this, this, and this, we'll get an outcome. Whereas the reality is much more like this. There's going to be a lot of problems, and this, is, I suppose, exacerbated by we actually start having that we've got our commercial objectives. So our commercial partners have a plan for what they're wanting to achieve. We've got our research partners have got an objective of what they want to achieve. And so that's pretty straight line. But then both sides have got a rocky path of implementation, which again comes back to how do we actually start to improve the communication processes? So we sort of come back into, if we've got joint objectives, how do we align the commercial pathway and the research objectives pathway? And really it's around this sort of communication and management, because when things get really rocky from the research side, we need to have some really frank discussions from the commercial side to make sure we get alignment, and vice versa. A competitor product comes in, what discussions need to be held with the research team to make sure that we can actually respond to those requirements and make sure that we're getting the best outcome that we can. So one of the things that we talk to a lot of our clients about is tools to help this, and there's a number around. We've got a commercialisation readiness assessment tool, which is built off NASA's technology readiness scale, and what it allows organisations to do is to look at where is the technology up to? How much knowledge do we actually have around a technology compared to other business model elements? And it starts to identify that, you know, an early stage technology, and this is pretty standard, doesn't have, you know, have much in the way of facts around market and customer knowledge, for example. So it all of a sudden is a trigger for the corporates to start to understand that, well, actually, if we keep just focusing on the technology and getting the validation right there without getting data around here, we're at risk. And so it starts to allow organisations to identify what some of their key priorities are going forward. And with those organisations with multiple projects, it starts to validate the dollars that are going into those multiple research projects. There's a commercialisation navigator tool which is built off that circular diagram, which again, what it does is actually develops joint Gantt charts, so that the commercial team have got a Gantt chart and the research team have got a Gantt chart, and the communication is actually around what each group is doing in terms of data collection around successfully getting an outcome from the research, so that we actually run the whole, if you like, adoption or extension process in parallel with the R&D process. And for larger organisations, the innovation management systems that are around at the moment, so I'm showing the Bright Idea one, you know, these systems are actually set up to manage research projects, to manage validation projects, and to actually improve the communication through the whole, the whole system and the way that things are operating. So they're just a few examples that there's tools out there that actually help with this communication piece. And we'll sort of do some Q&A in a moment, but it's one of the key reasons we continue to see a lot of research projects falling over, is that we just haven't sort of worked out how do we get both sides talking to each other. It's not about turning researchers into commercial animals. It's not about turning commercial parties into researchers. It's actually about harnessing the skills of these different teams into a team environment and then running it so that we can actually get some good outcomes. So some key takeaways is about this communication, and the management of the R&D is really critical. It's important to measure and monitor. And I mentioned right at the start about action items and ideas that you might take away. We really encourage you to sort of implement those things. Before we jump into the Q&A, if you do want a copy of the slides, as I said, it's in the chat in the Q&A section as well. Just go to the Impact Innovation site. It's under Lab Resources, and you can get access of the slide decks there. But hand over, I think, Gemma, you were going to sort of just run through the questions. I know we're a little bit over time, so apologies, everyone. But yeah, we'll stick around and sort of answer as many questions as we can.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I think you've all noticed the time there. It's 2:33.
Yep.
If you do need to jump off, please do so. This session's going to be recorded so we can send that out to everyone. So we'll just take about 10 minutes to answer some questions that we have here. So I might pose this one to Kathryn first. So Ravi has asked, once a patent is issued or under examination, can one publish the findings in a research journal, or does that make it non-novel?
That's a good question. I guess you can publish information that's in a patent before the publication of the patent, before examination has started for the patent. So once that patent is filed as a standard patent, for example, a PCT application, you can actually lodge a manuscript with a journal and have that manuscript published, and it won't affect the novelty of the patent because it'll be published after the filing date of the patent.
Thank you. And Brian, I have one for you. What are the pros and cons of working with institutional/university researchers versus contract research organisations, in brackets, CROs? And that was from Peter. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, look, the CROs are probably more geared around focusing on that research outcome because they've got a different business model. With a lot of the CROs, if you're doing early stage research with them, their business model is to actually upscale further in a lot of ways and to become, you know, longer term contract research partners and things like that. So we've seen, I suppose, more of a focus on handover out of CROs. And as I said, they've just got a slightly different business model. They're also geared up around doing shorter term research projects in a lot of cases. Whereas if you look at publicly funded research organisations, it's often a different operating environment. Now, I shouldn't say that the research is different, but it's sort of recognising that there's often different drivers from those different groups.
Thank you. So we also have another one from Stephen. Kathryn, I might start with you. So the IP that turns into a patent is usually well defined. What about know-how that isn't patented? How is this best captured so to reduce future potential conflicts between the company and the university?
That's a good question too. I certainly know with one of my clients that's currently undergoing research projects with a university, that they're actually they're setting out know-how that's included in their relationship, as well as the patents. So they're actually defining what know-how is important in their contractual agreements at the beginning. And I guess that's a pretty good option if you know what those know-how things are. But another thing to think about is that if you have, you need to be pretty careful about whether something's know-how or whether something is being kept back from the patent, you know, for the purposes of perhaps being able to make more money out of a license, because you need to make sure that your patent application actually has sufficient information for you to be able to perform the invention. If there's know-how associated with it required to actually perform the invention and that's not in the patent, then you might be jeopardizing the patent. But generally, you know, communication and agreements might be ongoing and renegotiated every now and then to update projects and things like that. So know-how should be included in any agreement if it's not in a patent.
Yeah, and I might just add to that, and Kathryn makes a really good last point there around the renegotiating of contracts. We're not saying that you should go out there and do that all the time, but we don't probably see it often enough. Because the whole thing is that when the contract's actually negotiated at the start, yeah, even in 6 months' time, things change. And there may be new know-how that's brought in, and sort of keeping in mind that we've got essentially experimental designs, we're running experiments, we're learning as we're going along. It could be that there's more know-how that's brought in. It could be that there's, you know, other things that are, you know, new inventions that are actually identified. And it's better to actually have those conversations up front. And a lot of the points that Kathryn had in her slides are really good, because they're the things that, you know, both parties need to be talking about more. Unfortunately, what we see happen is that a lot of cases people don't want to talk about it and sort of hope that, you know, they both come out of it alive at the end of it all. And that's where there's actually problems, because there's actually not this open communication with common objectives. And so then, yeah, you sort of get to the end of the project and it's, oh, geez, we did this other invention, and, you know, geez, who does own that? Because it's not written down anywhere. And then there's arguments about the resources that each party put in, and it just becomes messy.
Great. I have another one from Stephen, who says, as a researcher, I spend a lot of time communicating with partners in the companies, but a weakness is that the turnover in companies is quite high. How do you cope with the loss of your key contract in the company, or key contact, sorry, in the company?
Yep, and I might start on that one. It's a really, really good point to make. And I suppose I've always been bemused by, yeah, every 6 months or so, it sort of hits the papers as to who's to blame for the lack of research translation, and corporates blame researchers. You know, research organisations defend the work that their research teams are doing. You know, but we've often said, I know we've got a lot of corporates online here, and I'm going to get shot down, but some of the challenge is actually more on the corporate side in a lot of ways. So coming back to that circle diagram I showed, there's a lot of work that corporates need to put in to actually use a research outcome effectively. And so coming back to your point, if they've got research managers that are turning over or their point of contact isn't there, all of a sudden the research teams are left pretty out there and exposed because they're trying to do the best thing in actually completing the research based on scope. But it's actually really critical that the corporates have the resourcing from their side, making sure that there's proper handover with people if there is staff changes and things like that. But that, coming back to my earlier point, that they're collecting data that they need to make internal investment decisions, because it's not just the investment in the research, it's the investment in the commercialisation and the rollout or the use of the research outcome that's actually where the value occurs. And if they're not resourcing it properly, that's where it actually falls over.
Kathryn, do you have anything to add? Sorry.
I was just going to say I'd agree there, and I think it's important to document all of these things so that the corporate knowledge is maintained in the company and is not vested with just one person that might be working there at any one time.
Sorry, so we'll do our last two questions. Sorry, guys, if you do have any more questions, feel free to email Kathryn or Brian. We will have their contact details on the next slide. But we have one from Sophie who is asking, would there be any particular reason as to why the corporate party and the research organisation do not communicate effectively?
Yeah, look, I'll just make a comment about the contracts that are in use. I reviewed a contract for one of the companies I work with the university the other day. They're very transactional. Yeah, we dress it, because collaboration's a really cool word at the moment. We call it collaborative research. The agreements haven't changed. They're still the same agreements. They're still the same management structures. So they're not actually geared up to work in a collaborative way. And so I think that's one of the key challenges that we've got. Because coming back to, I suppose, those tools I was talking about, those approaches to actually, you know, that there's activities the research teams need to be doing, but there's activities that the corporate partners need to be doing. We're not... In those organisations that do research really well, we see that sort of activity happening. There's more regular communication happening. There's actually sharing of knowledge in those meetings. It's not a research team reporting to a commercial team. It's actually research team reporting to commercial team reporting to the research team. They're actually, communication is a two-way flow of information. And when that starts to occur, then they can start to overcome a lot of these challenges. But it comes back, the reason we see a lot of it not happening is that, yeah, same contracts, people dressing up collaboration when it's not really collaboration, but also the corporates in a lot of cases not understanding, I suppose, what they need to be doing in conjunction with the research as well.
I don't have anything to add to that.
No worries. And the last question from Ravi is, what kind of agreements are made to manage revenue generated by patents? Do all contributors, in brackets PhD students, postdocs, industry partners, get a share?
I think that that's a matter for, I guess, the research agreement and how that's set up. And it will depend on the university, the company, and the people involved. Certainly, I know that at least some universities have policies around the sharing of profits from that the university might accrue from any, I guess, successful commercialisation venture. And sometimes they're things like, you know, of the university profit, a third will go to the research group, a third will be shared between inventors, and a third will be used by the university. So there might be some sort of agreement there, and then there might be, I guess, some agreement amongst, if that sort of agreement with the university, or the university has that sort of policy, often at the time of filing the application, the people considered inventors or that have contributed in some way may have an agreement about how much of each or how much of the profit might be shared between each person, depending on what their contribution was. And I guess, but it's certainly not a there's not a standard for it. It's very much it very much depends on the institution and what their policies are. Generally, I should say, for companies, the same thing would occur, but I think it's probably less likely that a company would share in a sort of, I guess, a profit way. They might share bonuses, but that might be where a company might share out to their employees that have contributed to an invention.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both, Brian and Kathryn. I will just mention again that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar. And if you would like the presentation slides, you can head over to the Impact Innovation website, or you can email Brian or Kathryn. Their details are just there, and I'll just pass back over to Kathryn to wrap up.
So I'd really like to thank Brian for his contribution today. It's been fantastic, and I hope you've all really enjoyed it. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and hopefully we'll see you at another webinar in the future, or perhaps even speaking from Melbourne, somewhere in person in the future would be great too. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.